Welcome to Anews. I'm Omer Taslim and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. On today's episode, Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar and political analyst Javed Rana will be joining me to discuss Israel's genocide in the occupied Gaza Strip, the future of the war in Ukraine, and why President Donald Trump is pushing Syria to join the Abraham Accords. But before we talk about these topics and more, let's take a look at this news report.
Turkey's foreign policy seeks to safeguard national interests amid regional and global volatility, while fostering lasting peace and development both nearby and globally. To achieve this core objective, Turkey actively supports global peace, stability, and prosperity. Under the vision of the Century of Turkey, the country's foreign policy strives to reinforce regional peace, enhance the institutional framework of its international ties, foster regional economic growth, and help shape the evolving global order. Turkey places a strong emphasis on regional peace and security by countering terrorism and extremism, preventing conflicts, promoting peaceful solutions and mediation, and encouraging local ownership in the process. Turkey aims to broaden the foundation of its foreign relations by strengthening current ties and establishing new cooperation frameworks and outreach initiatives. Positioned at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, Turkey seeks to enhance existing strategic partnerships and build new ones. Turkey is steadily reinforcing its strong relationships with nations in the Balkans, the Middle East and North Africa, the Southern Caucasus, and South and Central Asia. In addition to its surrounding regions, Turkey is expanding its engagement in Africa and increasingly strengthening ties with countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Turkey employs a diverse set of political, economic, humanitarian, and cultural instruments, practicing a globally minded yet locally adapted diplomacy worldwide. A strong and resilient Turkey is increasingly recognized as a pillar of peace and stability across its surrounding regions, playing a vital role in advancing development, security, and cooperation on a broader scale.
Welcome back to the program. Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar, welcome to the program as well.
Thanks for having me, Omar.
Mustafa, today let's start with the informal summit of the Organization of Turkic States. It's underway in Hungary, in Budapest, the capital of Hungary. There are many important aspects to this for summit and many different agendas that need to be discussed. What's happening in Budapest right now, Mustafa? Because this is a very important summit being held in the observer country, which is Hungary. So what's on the agenda and what are leaders going to discuss today?
Omar, Turkish delegation today is participating in the informal summit of Turkic states in Hungary's capital, Budapest. And this summit is being held under the theme of meeting point of East and the West. And as you know, Organization of Turkic States was founded by Turkey, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. And on the other hand, Hungary, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, and Turkmenistan are observer states within the Organization of Turkic States. And it is clearly showing that Turkey is trying to strengthen cooperation among all Turkic states in the world. And today it is expected that Turkic states will sign several agreements to deepen bilateral or multilateral cooperation among Turkic states. And Turkey is leading the Turkic states in the world to ensure international peace and security. As you know, Turkey has been enjoying close relationships with all Turkic states in many fields, ranging from politics and economy to military and trade. And Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan and Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan are in Hungary right now. They will hold bilateral meetings with their counterparts from other Turkic states, and I hope that this informal summit of Turkic states will yield positive results not only for the national security and political stability for all those countries, and but also for the international peace and security.
Mustafa, let's discuss about Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. These three states formally recognized the Greek Cypriot side. Now, obviously, there are tensions, but the Turkish Foreign Ministry has said that these are just provocations, and people should not be discussing that there are rifts between Turkey and these states. So how is Turkey looking at this issue? And what is Turkey going to do? What actions do you think Turkey is going to take? Because people are saying that the European Union gave them money, and they chose money over relationships with Turkey. So that was a $12 billion deal, which was signed during the EU-Asia summit at the beginning of April. So tell me about this, Mustafa. How is Turkey approaching this issue and these tensions?
Umar, as you know, except Turkey, no one is recognizing the independence of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. But on the other hand, Turkey is always accelerating its diplomatic efforts to increase international awareness about the legitimate rights of the Turkish Cypriot people living on the Cyprus island. On the other hand, European Union engaged several Turkic states in Central Asia at the beginning of April, and since then, some Turkic states in the Central Asia have been taking steps to formally recognize the Greek Cypriot administration. They are reportedly appointing ambassadors to the Greek Cypriot administration, and they are trying to expand their cooperation with the Greek Cypriots. But on the other hand, Turkey is always reiterating that if there will be peace in the Eastern Mediterranean, international community will be supposed to recognize the legitimate rights of the Turkish Cypriots and the independence of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Within this context, I think Turkish decision makers will bring this topic to the table today, and they will discuss what can be done in terms of ensuring long-standing peace and stability in the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey, as you know, is always calling for further cooperation among Turkic states to deal with the shared and common security challenges. Within this context, I think Turkey will take new steps to convince the other Turkic states recognizing the independence of the Greek Cypriot administration, and I hope that Turkey will be able to convince other Turkic states to recognize the legitimate rights of the Turkish Cypriots living on the Cyprus island and independence of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. As you know, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus President Ersin Tatar is always calling for two-state solution to the Cyprus issue, while Turkey and the TRNC are in favor of diplomacy and dialogue to deal with the issue on the island. Greek Cypriot administration and Greece are trying to obstruct any peace talks between two communities living on the island, because Turkey is always claiming that Turkish Cypriots are always claiming that there are two separate nations living on the island, and one nation is the Turkish Cypriot and the other nation is the Greek Cypriots. I hope Turkey and other Turkic states will find a common way and common sense to deal with the bilateral or multilateral problems over the Cyprus issue.
Mustafa, just very briefly, the summit, the OTS summit, the formal summit will take place later this year in Baku, Azerbaijan. So what is Azerbaijan's stance on the recent tensions?
Umar, as you know, Turkey and Azerbaijan have been enjoying close relationships, and one nation, two states motto is defining the strong cooperation between Turkey and Azerbaijan. And I think that Azerbaijan can play an important role between Turkey and other Turkic states to deal with the problems among these countries. As you know, Azerbaijan is is also engaging direct talks with the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus to increase its cooperation with that country. As you know, last month, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus hosted Turkey's high-tech premier Technofest event, and many delegations from Azerbaijan and Turkey participated in the Technofest event held by the TRNC presidency, and it is clearly showing that Azerbaijan is taking steps to formally recognize the independence of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. As you know, Azerbaijan was hesitating to take steps over Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus because of its Karabakh problem with Armenia, but with Turkey's support and international geopolitics, Azerbaijan was able to liberate Karabakh from the Armenian occupation. As Karabakh issue is over, I think Azerbaijan can take steps in terms of recognizing the legitimate rights of the Turkish Cypriots living on the island. I hope Azerbaijan will facilitate any talks between Turkey and other Turkic states, and they will find a common way to recognize the independence of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus on the international arena.
Mustafa, the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, and Turkish President Erdoğan, they have both called for a ceasefire in Ukraine now. And this week, President Trump held phone calls with his counterparts. He discussed the issue, he discussed the war in Ukraine with French President Emmanuel Macron. He phone called the Russian president, the Ukrainian leader, and he held discussions with the British Prime Minister Starmer and the German Chancellor Merz. Now, what can we expect there? Because this is a development. Last week we saw talks were held in Istanbul. You know, they made a deal to exchange prisoners of war, but that was just one thing that came out of those talks in Türkiye. So now there's a new strategy. President Trump has discussed the war with both Zelensky and Putin. And now new talks could take place in Switzerland, in the Vatican, or maybe even Turkey. So what's the latest that we know for now, Mustafa?
Umar, as you know, the United States has been accelerating its diplomatic efforts in terms of ending war between Ukraine and Russia. And within this context, US President Donald Trump has been engaging direct talks with several international leaders to discuss what can be done in terms of reaching any ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. And this week, as you know, US President Donald Trump held a phone conversations separately with both his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky. Both Putin and Trump called their phone conversation fruitful in terms of discussing any possible ceasefire terms or peace terms. But as you know, there are many complex issues between Ukraine and Russia to deal with. And last week, Turkey's financial cultural capital, Istanbul, hosted peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio also represented the United States at the meeting. They didn't reach any ceasefire at that meeting, but as you mentioned about it, they reached agreement over the exchange of prisoners of war, and it is showing that Turkey has been becoming a center of regional and global peace diplomacy in recent years. And I think that there is right now Ukraine fatigue among European nations, and Hungary is one of the most important countries criticizing the European Union's ironclad support for the war in Ukraine. Hungary is claiming that Ukraine and Russia should sit at the negotiating table and they will reach a peace. Hungary is sometimes accusing the European Union of being a warmonger in the Ukrainian conflict. As you know, Turkey is also prioritizing diplomacy and dialogue to put an end to the conflicts in the Eastern Europe. I think that Turkey and Hungary can play important role, key important role in terms of bringing both Ukraine and Russia together to discuss any peace terms. If United States will take Turkey's and Hungary's security demands into the consideration, I think that international community will be able to facilitate and mediate peace talks between Ukraine and Russia.
Mustafa, thanks for that analysis. Let's take a look at this news report and we'll be right back.
The European Union agreed on Tuesday to lift its economic sanctions on Syria. That comes 1 week after President Donald Trump announced the US would lift its own Syria sanctions. However, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said the move was contingent on what she called progress.
There can be no peace without the path to economic recovery, and we all need a stable Syria. Is everything really ideal there? No, it is not. It's very clear. But I think we need to give the Syrian people a chance.
It's been 6 months since the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's rule over Syria. Its new rulers are trying to move quickly to revamp an economy shattered by more than a decade of civil war. The new leadership has prompted the EU and the US to rethink their Syria policies. After the EU announced its decision Tuesday, Syria's foreign minister said the move will boost his country's security and stability. Also in Tuesday's meeting, EU ministers discussed the situation in Gaza and relations with Israel. Pressure has grown on Netanyahu's government as it renews its offensive in Gaza. Kallas said the EU will review its trade deal with Israel.
What comes to the association agreement and the discussion around that, I will not say numbers and I will not say member states, but I can say it was a huge majority for this. I think what it tells is that the countries see that the situation in Gaza is untenable.
Welcome back to the program. Now let's take a look at the front page of Daily Sabah. Mustafa, again, some interesting headlines here. Israel presses war despite global peace. We know the situation in the occupied Gaza Strip right now. Yesterday, Israel allowed the entry of a few trucks of humanitarian aid, but that's not enough for the 2.3 million people who are occupied in the occupied Gaza Strip. Let's start with that, Mustafa. Tell me the latest updates from the occupied Gaza Strip.
Well, as you know, this week Israel launched its new grand invasion in the occupied Palestinian territory, Gaza Strip, and it is deteriorating the humanitarian conditions in the Gaza Strip. As you know, since October 7th, 2023, Israeli security forces have been murdering more than 50,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, living on the occupied Gaza Strip. And right now, international pressure is mounting on Israel to halt its military offensive there. Some Western countries are issuing a statement condemning the Israeli military offensive in the region. And as you know, European Union also pledged to review its free trade agreement with Israel to convince Israel to stop its military operations. I think that Turkey's efforts to increase international awareness about Israel's ethnic cleansing policies in Gaza is yielding positive results, because many Western countries right now are taking steps against Israel. And as you know, Israel is being diplomatically isolated from the international community. I think that pressure coming from the Western countries, including the United States and the European Union, will yield positive results in terms of ending the humanitarian crisis and tragedy in Gaza, and in terms of bringing long-standing peace and stability to the Middle East.
Mustafa, talking about the Middle East, Donald Trump was in the Middle East, where he decided that he would lift American sanctions on Syria. That was after a phone call with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan and negotiations with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Now, the European Union has said that it is also going to remove those sanctions. Tell us the latest about that.
Well, as you know, geopolitical landscape totally changed in Syria in December as the opposition forces took control of the country, and country's long-time ruler Bashar al-Assad fled Russia, and new era began in Syria. And since then, Syrian decision makers have been taking steps to rebuild and reconstruct the war-torn country. As you know, right now, Syria desperately needs international help to rebuild the political and economic infrastructure in the war-torn country. Since the very beginning of the new geopolitical landscape in Syria, Turkey has been taking steps to normalize its relationships with Syria, and Turkish decision makers are always calling for the lifting of sanctions on Syria. And as you know, 2 weeks ago, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan held a phone conversation with his American counterpart Donald Trump to discuss what can be done in Syria in terms of rebuilding and reconstructing the country. And as you mentioned about it, U.S. President Donald Trump last week paid an official visit to the Middle East, and he visited Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates. And on the sidelines of the Gulf Cooperation Summit in Saudi Arabia's capital, Riyadh, Trump also met with Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Shara. And following his meeting with Ahmed al-Shara, Trump announced his country's decision to lift sanctions on Syria. And finally, yesterday, the European Union also declared its decision about the sanctions relief for Syria. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas described the situation is very fragile in Syria, and she also mentioned about the international help for Syria, and they lifted sanctions on Syria. I hope it will bring more prosperity to Syria, and I think Turkey will increase its efforts for Syrian people and new Syrian government in the Middle Eastern country.
Mustafa, late last year, Devlet Bahçeli, who is the leader of the MHP, he led the initiative. He brought this initiative to the Turkish government of a terror-free Turkey, which meant holding talks with PKK's ringleader, who is currently jailed, Abdullah Öcalan, and to end PKK's terrorism for once and for all. Now, Erdoğan has said that ending terror would bring Turkey closer to its goals. At the bottom left, we have this headline here. Tell us more about this, Mustafa. On the weekend, we saw Öcalan meeting 2 members of the DEM party. So what's the latest? What steps is the Turkish government taking as of now?
Well, as you mentioned, opposition Nationalist Movement Party leader Devlet Bahçeli last year proposed terror-free Turkey initiative, and since then, Turkish government has been taking steps to realize the terror-free Turkey dreams. And in February, PKK terror groups imprisoned ringleader Abdullah Öcalan urged the separatist terror group to dissolve itself and lay down their weapons. And last week, PKK terror group announced its decision to disband itself and lay down their weapons. And right now, Turkish security forces and political leaders are closely monitoring the latest developments about the PKK terrorist organization's announcement. And Turkey is always also calling for cooperation among Turkey, Iraq and Syria, because as you know, PKK was not only operating in Turkey, PKK has been using Iraq as a base to launch attacks against Turkey, and PKK terror group Syrian offshoot PYD, YPG are also still active in Syria, but they made an agreement with the new rulers in Syria. I think that latest steps taken by the Turkish government to realize the Century of Turkey and terror-free Turkey goals, I think it will increase political stability and economic prosperity in Turkey, but also it will increase regional peace and stability in the Middle East region.
Mustafa, thanks for those updates. We'll continue to monitor all of these headlines in the days to come ahead. Now let's take a look at this news report, and we'll be right back.
U.S. President Donald Trump is pushing for Saudi Arabia and Syria to become the next countries to join the Abraham Accords, the diplomatic agreements that normalized ties between Israel and several Arab nations during his administration. Trump highlighted the economic and strategic benefits of the accords and encouraged broader participation from the region.
It's been an amazing thing, the Abraham Accords, and it's my fervent hope, wish, and even my dream that Saudi Arabia, a place I have such respect for, especially over the last fairly short period of time, what you've been able to do, but will soon be joining the Abraham Accords.
Trump also opened the door to Syria's potential involvement, framing it as a step toward ending decades of hostility and reintegrating into the international community. Including Syria would mark a significant and controversial expansion of the accords, given the country's long-standing tensions with Israel.
But in the future, we'll continue that progress by adding more countries to the Abraham Accords. We have the 4, and I think they're going to be filling up very rapidly. Biden didn't do anything because he never did anything about anything. He had no capability, had no ability, and it was a shame what he's done to so many countries, including our own.
While Saudi Arabia has been involved in discussions around normalization, Syria's inclusion would signal a major geopolitical development. Trump's comments appear aimed at reviving momentum for expanding the accords, positioning them as a key element of Middle East stability.
So I think it'll be a tremendous tribute to your country, and it will be something that's really going to be very important for the future of the Middle East. I took a risk in doing them, and they've been an absolute bonanza for the countries that have joined. The Biden administration did nothing for 4 years. We would have had it filled out.
Welcome back to the program. Joining us now from the Pakistani capital is political analyst Javed Rana. Javed, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Javed, let's start with the latest development between Israel and the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has suspended the free trade agreement with Israel and has summoned its ambassador as well. What are the latest developments, Javed? What can we see now?
Well, I think it is too late and too less. Long ago, all of these countries, all the European countries, Americans, should have sanctioned apartheid Israel. That did not happen. Now, there appears to be a bigger plan, and I think that's no longer a secret. The reason apartheid Israel has intensified so-called its ground offensive, which is, as a matter of fact, an intense airstrikes in Gaza, that is designed, that is aimed at expelling Palestinians from Gaza. And there are reports suggesting that perhaps they want to push them to Libya, which is already in turmoil. Now, we don't know exactly what is going to happen, but it looks like it is an expulsion plan. And Europe knows it, what is going to happen. Whatever they are doing it just for the public consumption. Because obviously, this after World War II, this is going to be the second kind of expulsion. In fact, second genocide, Holocaust, which is already taking place. Now, they are just trying to have some kind of face-saving. And what is happening inside occupied Gaza, that is unprecedented. Nearly 250 people have been starved to death. And within the next 48 hours, 14,000 children are going to die because they don't have any food, they don't have any water, and they don't have anything that with which the life can be survived, and life can be sustained. Again, this is a very, very terrible situation, and with an intensified airstrike operation, with the ground forces operating just on a deserted land because they are being bombed and no one is there to resist them. It is something, it's a big happening. The world is not looking at it. The Muslim world is not looking at it in a manner it really deserved. So I think in that context, what Canada, France, and UK has done, it is just tip of the iceberg of what should have been done long ago. That has not happened. Now it is an extraordinary humanitarian crisis taking place in Gaza. Extraordinary form of the genocide, ethnic cleansing, an artificial famine, and what we are hearing from UK, if they are recalling their investors, if they are suspending their so-called trade talks, at what time? When the people are going to be expelled from there, when already 61,000 people have been killed, when already 121,000 people have been maimed or injured, when already 95% infrastructure have been destroyed in Gaza. But again, we have to see what Muslim countries have done. They have not even done this. The Arab countries and those Muslim countries who have the diplomatic ties with apartheid Israel, have they suspended those ties? Have they recalled their ambassadors from there? That is a bigger question. I think in a broader context, when the history will be written, there will be a dark chapter on the Muslim countries with particular reference to the Arab countries who are paying Donald Trump with the trillions of dollars, at least with the $3 trillion. For what? To facilitate the genocide, because the Americans are the biggest suppliers of the weapons to the apartheid states, and then UK, which is now crying there about these humanitarian crises. They are the one who've been supplying weapons. They are the one who are supplying all kind of the intelligence. They are the one who are providing even the manpower, which is behind the scene working to conduct this genocide. This is an institutionalized hypocrisy with which the world is living. I think sooner or later, this Gaza chapter may come to a closing end. But the scenario, the Holocaust, is not very different to what happened during World War II in Germany. The conditions are the same. But again, what I'm saying time and again, where is the Muslim world? What are they doing? Their character will be written in dark words in the history.
Mustafa, like Javed said, it's too little, too late. Javed also criticized the lack of response from the Arab states. And now that 50,000 people have been killed in the occupied Gaza Strip, the UK and France have decided to take these actions. Now, where were the Muslim countries, the Arab states? Let's touch upon the Abraham Accords, Mustafa. Back in 2020, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco signed this agreement with Israel in order to recognize the state of Israel. In return for what? In return for trade, in return for investment, technology. So we can call it a bilateral agreement between Israel and the Arab states. But what has happened? Nothing has changed the Abraham Accords. 50,000 people have died, but the accords, the agreements are still continuing. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan have not objected anything, while thousands of women and children are dying. Tell me about this, Mustafa. Now Syria is also in the mix. Trump has also has not forced Syria, but it has asked Syria to join the Abraham Accords. So how are you looking at the current situation of the Abraham Accords, Mustafa, considering that 50,000 people have died in the occupied Gaza Strip?
Omar, during his first presidency, President Donald Trump initiated Abraham Accords, as you mentioned, in order to normalize relationships between Arab countries and Israel. And as you mentioned about it, four nations so far have normalized their bilateral relationships with the apartheid state Israel. But as you mentioned and as you know that Trump last week called on Saudi Arabia and Syria to join the Abraham Accords. But I think that it would be very optimistic to expect any normalization between Israel and between Saudi Arabia and Israel and Syria and Israel, because under the current geopolitical conditions in the Middle East, I don't think that Syria will be eager to recognize the independence of Israel, because as you know, Israel is occupying power in Syria, and Israel is still continuing to pursue expansionist policies in the Middle East. And many nations and countries in the Middle East are accusing Israel of trying to expand its territorial gains in the region. And it is clearly showing that Israeli decision makers are taking steps to put regional peace and stability at risk in the region. I don't think that Saudi Arabia and Syria will join the Abraham Accords in line with the expectation of Donald Trump administration. I think that all regional and international stakeholders should come together to resist against Israeli policies in the region in terms of normalizing their bilateral relationships with Israel under the current humanitarian tragedy in the occupied Palestinian territory, Gaza Strip.
Javed, I'll come back to you. Last week we saw when Trump was in the Middle East, he did not visit Israel. Apart from that, the release of the hostage, the American-Israeli hostage, Eden Alexander, that was conducted by the Trump administration. Israel was not involved in those talks. So can we say that there are tensions between Netanyahu and Trump? Because Trump is someone who's not going to listen to anyone. He's going to make his own decisions. So why is Trump bringing Israel to this point? Do you think that there are tensions between the two leaders, or there are many disagreements?
Donald Trump has no problem with apartheid Israel and their long-standing agenda of expansion in the Middle East. But he has a problem with the Netanyahu. Netanyahu is a too much fascist extremist. He's not listening to anyone. He's not stopping this war, despite the fact that the Hamas, by and large, has been eliminated. It's only the skeleton network inside Gaza. That's why we have seen that a couple of incidents where Donald Trump, through his hand-picked ambassador, he directly dealt with Hamas, and Hamas released one of the American prisoners of war. I think that was a small indicator. But we should not hope too much on what Donald Trump has dealt in a manner that Donald Trump has dealt this crisis. Reason being is, at the end of the day, the relationship between apartheid state and the U.S. are so strong. They are least concerned about the humanitarian crisis. They are least concerned about the genocide which is taking place, because it was Donald Trump himself who was saying that if people from the occupied Gaza, if they don't leave the occupied territories, they would be expelled, and then they would be responsible for the consequences. And they, like Netanyahu, he's been saying that the people are responsible for sheltering Hamas. This is the complete nonsense. We should not forget of what Donald Trump has been saying. We should not forget that Donald Trump is responsible for this October 7, 2023 Hamas military operation against apartheid Israel. The reason was this Abraham Accord, because Hamas felt and other jihadi groups in Palestine felt that if they don't carry out attack against the apartheid state, that means the 7 Muslim countries, including Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and some of the African Muslim countries, they would normalize their diplomatic ties with Israel, and that means their cause of an independent Palestinian state would be shelved. That was the core reason. These are the facts which are known to everybody. This is a well-referenced fact, because this is something the then foreign minister of Israel had said in September 2023. So all I'm saying is that we should not attach our hopes with a Donald Trump-like character who believes in making money out of human tragedies. For him, it is not a problem because these are the Muslims. And he has not responded back when he was asked that, will you like that people from the occupied West Bank are also expelled? His response was that we have not decided anything on it, which means he's more inclined towards that direction. I think in a broader context, yes, there is some movement from the Europe and some indication from Washington that they don't want Netanyahu to continue with this genocide, because for them it is becoming a political problem. But I think sooner or later you will see the situation in Europe situation in the USA is not very different to what was happening in Germany before World War II. There is a similar resentment against the Jewish community. I believe every member of the Jewish community is not responsible for the disastrous policy of Zionists. But my fear is they may face consequences sooner or later in years to come, given the industrial scale of the genocide that is taking place in occupied Gaza.
Political analyst Javed Rana, thank you so much for joining us from the Pakistani capital. It was a pleasure having you on the program. Anews editor Mustafa Kojakanar, thank you for being on the program. It was a pleasure of ours to listen to your analysis as well.
You are welcome, Omar.
And that wraps up this edition of Turkey's Diplomacy. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back soon with more insights.